I am delighted to welcome you all to the first Holocaust Living History workshop of the new academic year. A big thank you to all of our generous donors and to the UC San Diego Library and the Jewish Studies program for their ongoing support of the workshop. We appreciate you tremendously. Today's event features Francine Hirsch, who is joining us from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She will be introduced by Professor Amelia Glaser, an expert on Russian, Ukrainian, and Yiddish literature. And those of you who have attended in the past, you have seen Professor Glaser. The topic of today's talk reminds us that once upon a time, the Americans and the Soviets, or Russians, were allies. From today's vantage point, this alliance may seem rather puzzling, but perhaps also mildly encouraging. Professor Hirsch's talk will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit the question. I will keep track of these questions throughout the talk and share them with our guests after the lecture. And now I'd like to invite Amelia Glaser to join me on screen. Amelia?
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It's really an honor to get to introduce Professor Francine Hirsch. She's the first speaker in the 2022-23 Holocaust Living History Workshop. Francine Hirsch is the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin. And her first book, Empire of Nations, Ethnographic Knowledge and the Making of the Soviet Union, helped to define the way that scholars still understand the relationship between the purportedly internationalist Soviet Union and the national and ethnic identities that emerged after 1917. The book had a profound influence on my own work, especially on the Soviet-aligned Yiddish writers of the interwar period that I wrote my last book about. What she helped me to understand is how a state could be, supposedly could purport to be anti-racist and could even lead a fight against race theory, the Nazi race theory on the eve of World War II, but nonetheless end up using party line identity politics as a means of shaping a colonial relationship that was centered in Moscow. And Professor Hirsch's most recent book, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, A New History of the International Military Tribunal after World War II, came out with Oxford University Press in 2020. This is a phenomenal study of Soviet legal history. It also reads very well, so I highly recommend the book to all of you. Among other things, Professor Hirsch describes the collision between a kind of serious investigative trial that was unfolding at Nuremberg and the show trials that had been taking place under Stalin for nearly 2 decades at that point. She also demonstrates the double bind that the Nuremberg trials presented to the Stalin regime. On the one hand, the USSR was ideologically and militarily victorious over Nazism. On the other hand, the detail of the trial unearthed not only war crimes committed by Nazis, but also war crimes committed by the Soviet Union, for example, the Katyn massacre. Professor Hirsch's meticulous approach to Soviet and more broadly European history is exactly the kind of scholarship that we need right now. She helps us to ask important questions. Among these are, how do we document war crimes? How is ideological rhetoric, even rhetoric that was at one time anti-racist or anti-ethno-nationalist, used to justify the perpetuation of what is actually a form of violent colonialism or neocolonialism? I will confess that since February, I have been fantasizing about a Nuremberg trial, a kind of trial where everything is revealed, where new borders will align with some sort of international justice. And I'm talking, of course, about Ukraine, but utterly essential as the actual Nuremberg trials were, Nuremberg, of course, didn't bring anyone back. And in fact, it also generated new ideological animosity in the Cold War. And in fact, as Professor Hirsch has written, she wrote this in a recent Washington Post article, there's a danger of Russia presenting a kind of sham war crimes trial in Mariupol, for example, as a successor to the more clear-cut Nazi war crime trials of Krasnodar and Kharkov. Professor Hirsch has written broadly and admirably for a general audience, especially over the past 6 months, since February 24th and the invasion of Ukraine. She's written about the relevance of legal history to the present situation, about whether to characterize Russia's atrocities in Ukraine as genocide, about Russia's legal strictures on its own citizens. With that, I will leave the floor to Professor Francine Hirsch. I'm so pleased that she's made time to speak with us about her work. Thanks.
Now, okay. I'm assuming everyone can hear me okay. Great. All right, thank you. Well, I just thank you so much. I really like to thank the UC San Diego Library and Jewish Studies program for inviting me to talk with you today. And my goodness, thank you so much, Professor Glaser, for that just really lovely introduction. I'm really honored to be with you and to talk about Soviet judgment at Nuremberg. And I'll be talking some towards the end of the talk as well about the present moment. Really, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February, there has been a lot of talk among lawyers and scholars and in the news about the need for a new Nuremberg moment. There's been talk about holding Russia's leaders, Putin and others, and Russia's soldiers accountable for crimes against humanity and war crimes. And there's been talk about convening a Nuremberg-like tribunal to try Russia's leaders for waging a predatory or illegal, war of aggression for crimes against peace. And I think that it's a really fitting time to revisit Nuremberg's history and to reflect a bit on its lessons and its legacy. So today what I'll be doing is I'll present an overview of my book, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, and I'll then lay out the four main arguments. I'll then talk about Nuremberg's significance for today, and I really look forward to the conversation that follows with all of you. So to begin, as many of you know, the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, convened from November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946 at the Palace of Justice in occupied Germany. And I'm just trying to get my slideshow to go forward. So just excuse me for one. Oh, here we go. Perfect. All right. Great. And here we have the front of the courtyard and the courthouse, and we see the occupied zone. The United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, the four major Allied powers, tried 22 former Nazi leaders, people like Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel. They tried them for conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. They also tried 6 Nazi organizations, including the Gestapo and the SS. This was the first of the Nuremberg trials, and it would turn out to be the only for Power One. Here in the United States, Nuremberg is still very much remembered as an American story and as an American triumph. In popular books and films, it's the US Chief Prosecutor, the Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, who is celebrated and held up as the driving force behind the entire trial. The British and the French, they're depicted in these films and in these memoirs as playing noble but supporting roles. And the Soviets, well, they're barely discussed at all. And when they are discussed, there's little, if any, information about their positive contribution to the trials. Now, there's very good reason for this lack of attention to the Soviet contribution to Nuremberg, including, to start, restricted access to the former Soviet archives, which was very much the case during the Cold War and is unfortunately the case, of course, once again, right? There's also the fact that the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials, including the Einsatzgruppen trial, were carried out by the United States alone. But I think that there's also a deeper issue at play, a discomfort with historical complexity. The Soviet role in the Nuremberg trials, it was complicated. The Soviets were carrying out deportations in Poland and in Hungary, even as the IMT was hearing evidence against the Nazis. There were episodes involving the Soviets at Nuremberg that everyone wanted to forget, such as the Soviet effort to use the IMT to blame one of their own atrocities, the Katyn massacre of thousands of Polish prisoners of war, Polish officers, to blame that on the Nazis. in a more general sense too, I think, the contribution of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union to the IMT kind of upends the myth, like a nice myth, right, of Nuremberg as being fully grounded in liberal ideas about justice and the law. Well, I argue in my book, and I still very much believe, that we need the full Nuremberg story in all of its complexity. That if Nuremberg is to offer meaningful lessons, and I think that's especially important right now at this moment, we need to understand what actually happened. And with this in mind, in the book, I really aim to bring the Soviets fully into the picture. I drew on evidence from 5 Moscow archives to do so. And the kinds of materials that I worked with included things like protocols of 2 secret Soviet Nuremberg commissions. It included things like telegrams from Nuremberg to Moscow and back, often via Berlin. And those kinds of materials were at the archive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I used things like letters and diaries and surveillance reports written by Soviet writers, the Soviet correspondents who were on the ground there, and by Soviet diplomats. And these letters are amazing. They really give us a sense of the ups and downs of the trials and also of the day-to-day life of the members of the Soviet delegation. We get their impressions of the city, of the food, of the nightlife, like what they think of the defendants when they see them for the first time. The materials I worked with also included things like marked up copies of documents like the indictment and the judgment that the Soviet delegation secretly smuggled back to Moscow for review and approval. And here we even see, well, I was able to see in the archive, it was kind of amazing to see Stalin's handwriting on some of these documents with some of his comments. Through these kinds of materials, we see the tremendous Soviet contribution to the trials, but we also see the many ways in which Soviet participation threatened to undermine the IMT's legitimacy. So the book also aimed to use the Soviet piece, like that Soviet story, and the Soviet archives combined with other sources to tell a richer story of the Nuremberg trials as a whole. Because looking at the relationship among all 4 powers, right, among the Soviets and the Americans and the British and the French, it really opens things up. People sometimes forget that there were 4 prosecution teams at Nuremberg, right? There were 4 main judges, one representing each country of the prosecution and an assistant judge representing each country of the prosecution. The relationships among the prosecutors and among the judges and between the prosecutors and the judges are highly revealing. We see clashes about the meaning of justice and compromises that were made on all sides. We also see things like the importance of the nightlife and the parties. And really, there's so much alcohol in Nuremberg. They're drinking all the time after hours. And we see the role that played for keeping things congenial and actually for sometimes keeping the trials on track. We also see how the Nuremberg courtroom became a front of the Cold War and how this later affected the telling of the Nuremberg story. So I want to say just a few words about the narrative arc of the book. So the book starts during the Second World War, at the time of the German occupation of the Soviet Union. It covers the road to Nuremberg, focusing on the contentious negotiations about the Nuremberg Charter and about the indictment, which set out the charges. It then tells the story of the trials, taking readers through the drama of the prosecution's case, the defense case, and the judgment, which to the dismay of the Soviets, as we'll see, resulted in several acquittals. It ends with a chapter on Nuremberg's aftermath, looking at its legacy in the post-war period and at its legacy in general on the development of international law, post-war international law, and discussions about human rights. Now, to be honest, one of my aims with this book was to tell a good story and to introduce readers, even those familiar with Nuremberg and the Nuremberg story, to a new cast of characters. And so one of the things I try to do in the book is to tell the story of Nuremberg and the trial through the eyes of some of the Soviet participants. People like the Soviet documentary filmmaker, Roman Karman, and the Soviet political cartoonist, Boris Efimov, and the playwright, Vsevolod Vishnevsky, and other Soviet correspondents. And here we have Karman, third from the right, and other correspondents posing in front of the Grand Hotel, right, in Nuremberg. Some of these correspondents, like Carmen and Yefimov, had been embedded with the Red Army during the war and had witnessed the liberation of the concentration camps. They brought that experience with them into the Nuremberg courtroom. And I think that this is really important for just getting a sense, again, of what was at stake in all of this for the Soviet Union. We also see the Soviets and the Americans and the British and the French just kind of getting to know each other. And here, Robert H. Jackson's unpublished diaries, which are at the Library of Congress, and anyone who's near Washington, I urge you to stop by, have a look. They're fascinating, and they're full of all kinds of observations. And just to give you one little snippet, Jackson judged one dinner that he hosted during the lead up to the trials to have been, and I'll quote him here, very successful from the point of view of cultivating better relations, even as he noted that the Soviets, and I'm quoting again, drank very little and were somewhat scornful of the yellow liquid claimed to be vodka, which was served. We also see the outside, oh, here's one of Yefimov's political cartoons, by the way. Threw that in there to show you, because he was sketching the whole time that he was observing the trials, and his political cartoons appeared mostly in Izvestia and some of them in Pravda, the two main Soviet newspapers. Okay. We also see the outsized role of Andrei Vucinich. He was the Soviet deputy foreign minister and the head of one of the Soviet Nuremberg commissions, the secret Soviet Nuremberg commissions. Vucinich, though, had a history, a past of his own. He had been the chief prosecutor in the Moscow trials of 1936 to 1938, major show trials that Stalin had used to take down his political enemies. And I think it's telling that this is who Stalin put in charge of the secret commission for Nuremberg. Although Vucinich spent just 1 week actually in Nuremberg, his influence was constant for the Soviet delegation. So I'm going to talk a bit now about the book's four main arguments. I'll have a cup of tea with me, so a little sip right now. Excuse me. All right, so the first argument that I make in the book is that without the Soviet Union, the Nuremberg trials likely never would have happened. The Soviets took up the question of Nazi criminality during the darkest days of the war, prompted in part by the brutality of the Nazi occupation. In April 1942, the Soviet foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, published his third note on German atrocities, citing evidence that the burning of villages and the massacre of civilians were part of a deliberate German plan. 4 months later, in October 1942, the Soviets publicly called for the convening of a special international tribunal. And that's the phrase that they use, a special international tribunal. And they invited all interested governments to cooperate in bringing Hitler, Goering, Hess, and other Nazi leaders to justice. And I think it's just important to realize that the Soviets were really the ones who were out in front here. The US and Britain, they were slow to come on board. The US government worried about reprisals against Allied prisoners of war. The British argued that the crimes of Nazi leaders were far too serious for a trial, and they pushed instead for punishment by executive decree without a legal process. And so the Soviets went down their own path. They created their own War Crimes Commission, the Extraordinary State Commission, and they opted not to participate in the United Nations War Crimes Commission, the UNWCCC, which met in London beginning in October 1943. And the Soviets were the only Allied power not to be part of the UNWCC. Even as the Soviets went down their own path, though, the Soviet lawyer, Aaron Trainin, from Moscow's Institute of Law, greatly influenced the international discussion about war crimes through his writings. Trainin argued that the planning and waging of wars of aggression should be punished as crimes against peace. And Trainin coined this term. Trainin also argued that Nazi leaders could and should be tried for participating in these crimes and for participating in a criminal conspiracy. This is his term as well. And he challenged the legitimacy of the defense of following superior orders. In other words, just because a soldier says that he's followed superior orders doesn't mean that he gets off the hook, right? Treinen initially set out his ideas in a report for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It was then turned into a book called The Criminal Responsibility of the Hitlerites. And Andrei Vucinich, right, the prosecutor of the Moscow trials, he wrote the introduction. Treinen's book made its way across Europe to Britain, where it was translated into English and discussed by the members of the United Nations War Crimes Commission. It then crossed the Atlantic to the United States, where it landed at the War Department's Special Projects Branch and then at the White House. Now, Treinen was not the only lawyer arguing at this time for the criminality of aggressive war. This was a conversation that lots of lawyers were having. But whereas many American and European lawyers expressed unease about ex post facto or retroactive law, the Soviets, they had no such reservations. After the victory, when the other Allied powers came around to the idea of an international tribunal, Treinen helped to shape its framework. He was one of the 2 representatives that the Soviets sent to the 4-power London conference in the summer of 1945 to work out the Nuremberg Charter. Crimes against peace, his contribution became one of the 3 categories of crime set out in the Charter's Article 6, along with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Treinen was then part of the Soviet delegation at Nuremberg, and we can see him sort of second on the left-hand side there, and you can see his pass for the IMT in the bottom. And then the first in the very corner on the right, that's Rudenko, the Soviet chief prosecutor. So he's in this photo as well. Okay, so moving on now to the book's second main argument. The book's second main argument is that the Soviets had no idea what they had set in motion and were greatly handicapped on the international stage by the constraints of Stalinism. The Soviets thought that Nuremberg would be a show trial. They took Nazi guilt as a given, and they were expecting guilty verdicts and hangings down the line. They certainly did not expect the defendants to be allowed to take the stand in their own defense or to be allowed to call witnesses. Soviet expectations shaped their choice of personnel for Nuremberg. Almost all members of the Soviet delegation of the Soviet legal team were connected to the Soviet show trials of the 1930s. The Soviet judge, Yona Nikitchenko, had been a judge in the Moscow trials. The Soviet chief prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, had served as a prosecutor for show trials in the 1930s in Ukraine. Soviet assistant prosecutors had similar show trial credentials. The Soviets thought that the victors would control the script, just as the prosecution had done in the Soviet Union's show trials in the 1930s and before, just as the prosecution had done in the Soviet Union's own war crimes trials as well, trials like the Kharkov trial of December 1943. The Soviets were so confident that the prosecution would control the script that they insisted on including the Katyn massacre, right, their own war crime, in the indictment as a Nazi war crime. They didn't think the defendants would be allowed to challenge their evidence. They were so confident of the victors controlling the script that Soviet leaders initially didn't bother to tell Rudenko about the secret protocols to the Soviet-German non-aggression pact of 1939. These are the secret protocols in which Hitler and Stalin agreed to divide up Poland and the Baltic states and some other areas. They thought that Rudenko just didn't need to know, even though Ribbentrop, who had signed this pact, was one of the defendants. The secret protocols became an issue at the very start of the trials in November 1945, and this prompted Andrei Vucinich's visit to Nuremberg. He was sent to Nuremberg to give Rudenko key information that no one had told Rudenko before, and to help Rudenko stand down this challenge from the defense. So why, you might be wondering, did Soviet leaders initially think they didn't need to tell Rudenko about the secret protocols? And there are a couple of important things to consider here. First of all, the Nuremberg Charter had established that the IMT would only address European Axis crimes, so it wasn't going to address crimes of the Allied powers. Second, The prosecutors had agreed before the trial started that they would work together to keep awkward topics like their own country's war crimes, to keep that out of the courtroom. And they did this actually at Jackson's suggestion. The Soviets referred to this as their gentleman's agreement. Back in Moscow, kind of on the eve of Vucinich's trip to Nuremberg, Soviet leaders made a list of taboo topics that they wanted kept out of the courtroom. This list included a number of items about Soviet-German relations, including, and I'm quoting here, the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 and all questions relating to it, in other words, the secret protocols. It also included more general topics, such as Soviet-Polish relations. Vucinich shared this list with Rudenko when he arrived in Nuremberg. He told Rudenko to reach a verbal agreement with the Western prosecutors to steer clear of these topics. He did not give Rudenko permission to share a physical copy of the list, lest the Soviets lose the shield of plausible deniability. So, as I mentioned, there was lots of socializing and lots of alcohol and lots of parties and lots of dinner parties. And the prosecutors socialized amongst each other too. There were a lot of dinner parties they went to. And after one night of a dinner party with a lot of alcohol, Rudenko reported back to Vucinich that everything was set. The prosecutors had reached this agreement that he was supposed to help them to reach, right? But there was something that Rudenko and Vucinich and Stalin, for that matter, that they didn't understand. They didn't understand that the Western judges, unlike the Soviet judge Nikitchenko, that the Western judges were operating independently from their governments, and that the Western judges were also operating independently from their country's prosecutors, right? For the Soviets, the judge and the prosecutor, they were kind of a team working together. That wasn't the case for any of the other delegations. Also, the Western judges were not necessarily on board with keeping particular topics out of the courtroom. In fact, the Western judges were very worried about allegations of victor's justice. Throughout the trials, the Western judges, over Nikitchenko's objections, gave significant leeway to the defendants, who did what they could to put forward their own narrative about the war. Now, I'll just mention a few other ways in which the Soviets also felt the constraints of Stalinism. The Soviet delegation, as I think you're getting a sense of, had much less independence than the other delegations. And the process of constantly having to check in with Moscow and wait for instructions, it actually really got in their way. Instructions back from Moscow often arrived too late to be of real use. Documents were sometimes lost in transit. And Nikitchenko and Rudenko then were deprived of the flexibility that they really needed to negotiate, and they were often left scrambling. Other things, too, also got in the way of the Soviet delegation, some other constraints of Stalinism. The Soviet delegation didn't have enough skilled interpreters in Nuremberg, partly because many German speakers had been arrested and shot during the Stalinist terror, and partly because the Soviet Union's Ministry of Internal Affairs, the NKVD, was reluctant to clear people who knew foreign languages, especially German, for travel abroad. Another thing I'll mention is that the Soviet prosecution was terrible at cross-examination, and that really got in their way during the defense case because, they were used to show trials. They weren't used to defendants who having able defense attorneys and mounting a vigorous defense. Okay. So the book's third argument. The book's third argument is that at Nuremberg, the Soviets presented powerful proof of what we now know as the Holocaust and what at the time was discussed as Hitler's final solution. This Soviet contribution is often overlooked still, in part because earlier Soviet war crimes trials, like the Kharkov trial, spoke of crimes against peaceful Soviet citizens, even when the victims were Jews. And in part because of the Soviet Union's anti-Semitic, anti-cosmopolitan campaign that was launched in the years after Nuremberg. But at Nuremberg, the Soviet prosecution presented extensive evidence of the Nazi plan to exterminate Europe's Jews. The Soviet assistant prosecutor Lev Smirnov introduced shocking documents, including a report from the commanders of Einsatzgruppe A, and I'll quote here, bragging about, and here's the quote, having fulfilled orders to eliminate the Jews to the fullest possible extent in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They introduced evidence, including a Polish government report, and I'll quote again, stating that 3 million Jews have been exterminated in Poland. Eyewitnesses for the Soviet prosecution also testified about the Nazi campaign to wipe out the Jews. Now, just as an aside here, the Soviets almost didn't send eyewitnesses to Nuremberg. The Soviet security police had been screening possible witnesses for the Soviet prosecution since November 1945. But Soviet leaders had been considering having the Soviet prosecution build its case on documents alone. Well, the Soviet prosecution presented its part of the case last. Like they went in turn. So it was, the Americans went, and then the British went, and then the French went, and then it was the Soviets. And while the Soviets struggled at Nuremberg for some of the reasons that we've been talking about, they also adapted and made course corrections along the way. And they made the decision to send eyewitnesses in January 1946, right on the eve of the Soviet case. The Soviets it was their turn starting in February. And in January, Rudenko was actually back in Moscow for the holiday break, meeting with Stalin. The Soviet prosecution ultimately called 7 eyewitnesses to testify about Nazi war crimes and crimes against humanity. And really, this testimony ends up being the most compelling and the most memorable part of their case. 2 of these eyewitnesses, Avraham Sutzkever and Samuel Rajman, were selected specifically to testify about Nazi crimes against the Jews. Sutzkever, a Yiddish poet, had been interned in the Vilna ghetto. He and his wife, Fredka, had fled the ghetto in September 1943 and joined a group of partisans in the forests of northwestern Belarusia. Before escaping from the ghetto, Sutzkever had managed to smuggle out some of his poems, which reached the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee back in Moscow. In March 1944, the Soviets staged a rescue operation. They were so impressed by Sutzkever's poetry and saw him as kind of an ideal witness survivor. So they staged a rescue operation, airlifting him and Fredka out of German-occupied territory. Back in Moscow, Sutzkever worked with the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee to compile evidence of the Nazi murder of Jews throughout the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The Soviet prosecution called Sutzkever to the witness box in late February 1946. His testimony was harrowing. He spoke about the Einsatzgruppen and the systematic killing of Jews in Vilna. He also recounted the murder of his newborn son by German soldiers in the ghetto hospital. Sutzkever was the only witness to remain standing in the witness box, as he wrote in his diary, which has actually recently been translated into English, as if it had been a matter of saying Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. And he considered it a matter of Jewish destiny. He also wrote that he, a Yiddish poet, had survived to judge Alfred Rosenberg and Hans Frank in Nuremberg, and through them, all who adhered to their ideology. Sutzkever, as a Jew and a partisan, understood that he was speaking on behalf of the Soviet people and the Jewish people. His testimony was critical for the Soviets, as was the evidence presented by Smirnov. They told the story of the annihilation of the Jews while integrating it into a larger narrative about the wartime suffering of the entire Soviet people in the occupied East. Okay. The book's 4th argument, the last one that I'll talk about today, is the following: that by the end of the Nuremberg trials, Nuremberg had become a Cold War battleground. And this helps explain why Nuremberg's promise was not fully realized in the decades that immediately followed. We tend sometimes to think about Nuremberg as a struggle between the prosecution and the defense, right? Like any good courtroom drama. But it was also a contest among the countries of the prosecution for power and influence and control over the narrative of the war. The United States, France, Britain, and the Soviet Union, they all wanted to use the IMT to bring the Nazis to justice and to strengthen their international influence. But as I mentioned earlier, they had different ideas about justice, and they had different, and in some cases competing, visions for the post-war order. While the prosecution was presenting its case from November 1945 through February 1946, right, with the Soviets going last, tensions among the four powers were mostly kept under wraps. And then in March 1946, the Cold War blew into the Nuremberg courtroom. On March the 5th, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, calling for Anglo-American resistance to Soviet tyranny. The very next day, the defense case began in Nuremberg. When the Soviets got to the courtroom, there were copies of the US Army newspaper, Stars and Stripes, scattered everywhere with this heading, "Unite to Stop Russians." The defense attorneys were actually holding up copies for their clients to read over their shoulders, and a lot of the memoirs talk about this. All of this energized the defense, who upped their efforts to drive a wedge between the Soviets and the Western powers. And the defense had great success in the weeks and months that followed. Goering insisted that Germany had launched a preventive war against the Soviet Union and not a war of aggression. Ribbentrop riveted the courtroom with his description of the secret protocols to the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact. He argued that if Germany was guilty of crimes against peace, then the Soviets certainly were too. In fact, one Soviet informant writing home to Moscow after Ribbentrop's testimony, he expressed alarm, and I'll quote here from this telegram he sent home, alarm that the Soviet Union, a country of victors, had gone to Nuremberg to prosecute the fascists and had instead become the object of their provocative attacks. Goering's attorney also petitioned for witnesses to counter Soviet charges about Katyn, and the three Western judges outvoting or overruling Nikitchenko, they allowed it. In July, 3 defense witnesses and 3 Soviet witnesses testified about Katyn. Enough doubt was cast on the Soviet version of events that no mention of Katyn appeared in the judgment. Now, the after-hours socializing, this continued and in some ways really helped keep the trials on track. And as the weather got warmer, there were tennis matches and all kinds of get-togethers. But back in Moscow, Soviet leaders interpreted all decisions that the judges made that went against their interests as part of an Anglo-American anti-Soviet plot. In the end, Moscow was also disappointed with the verdicts. 12 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, 3 were acquitted, and the others, including Hess, received prison sentences. Stalin, of course, had been expecting guilty verdicts and hangings down the line. As a result of Nuremberg, the Cold War and the post-war movement for human rights became very much entangled. The United States and the Soviet Union, they began accusing each other constantly of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity and crimes against peace. This becomes a sort of a soundtrack of the Cold War. And this in turn shaped and for a long time hampered discussions in the United Nations and other institutions about the creation of a permanent international criminal court. Okay, so I want to spend the rest of my time and kind of conclude by reflecting on Nuremberg's legacy. And I hope that we can continue this part of the discussion as well during the Q&A. Bringing the Soviets fully into the story reminds us that the IMT was not simply a result of Western leadership and liberal idealism. Nuremberg involved very difficult negotiations and very difficult compromises among the victors. Nuremberg's achievements were significant. The IMT created a comprehensive record of the crimes of the Third Reich, and that in itself, I think, is very significant. It laid the foundation for new laws and institutions devoted to the protection of human rights, even if some of those were a bit of a long time coming. Nuremberg also introduced the idea of the progressive development of international law, the idea that law is not static, that law must evolve in keeping with the public conscience. That's how they talked about this at the time. And Nuremberg provided the impetus for new institutions that ultimately came into being and have an important role today, of course, like the International Criminal Court. Now, that's the uplifting point that I end my book with, my book that was published in 2020. But since then I've been thinking a lot more too about Nuremberg's limitations, and I really think it's critically important to talk about those as well. And while I talk about this in the book and it comes through in the conclusion, I somehow felt the need to be just uplifting. But I want to talk now about some of the problems too. I think it was a problem that the IMT tried only the crimes of the European Axis powers. And that as a result, the Nuremberg verdict blamed Nazi Germany alone for certain Soviet German crimes against peace. And I'll just say that Russian President Vladimir Putin, he likes the Nuremberg verdict a lot. He invokes it a lot, and he likes it for precisely that reason. The Soviet Union, as one of the 4 countries of the prosecution, was not held accountable at Nuremberg for the secret protocols to the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact. It was not held responsible for the invasion of Poland in September 1939, for its invasion on September 14th. Nor was it held responsible for its invasion and annexation of the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia less than a year later. And a recent Russian memory law, in fact, makes it illegal to talk about these Soviet crimes against peace. And it too cites, as kind of an explanation for why this is against the law, of the findings of the Nuremberg verdict. Again, I think this especially matters now, at least partly because Russia's invasion of Ukraine has important parallels with the Soviet invasion of Poland and the Baltic states. Putin in 2022, like Stalin in 1939, is attempting to reconfigure the geopolitical balance of power. Putin, like Stalin, is attempting to enlarge his state and expand its influence with claims to territories that had once been part of a larger empire. Putin, like Stalin, has launched a war of aggression while calling it a special operation aimed at aiding civilians and restoring the peace. Like very, very cynical. We must acknowledge Nuremberg's achievements and also its flaws. At the same time, and really above all else, this is the moment for us to prove, us, the world, right, that Nuremberg matters, that we as an international community believe in the Nuremberg principles, that we as an international community will not tolerate crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, that we will hold a state's leaders criminally responsible for launching a predatory war of aggression and for the torture, deportation, and murder of civilians. It's my hope that we'll look back to Nuremberg in all of its complexity and take inspiration from it and learn from it when the time comes, hopefully soon, to hold Russia's leaders accountable. So thank you so much for your attention, and I really look forward to a conversation with all of you now. Oh, here we have, I had a couple more slides. This is one of my favorites of the Soviet prosecution team, as things are not going well for them during the defense case. And here are just a few headlines that I pulled on, one of them from something I wrote, but others from things that other people wrote about. Mine was an article I wrote on Ukraine and Russia, both looking to the Nuremberg trials, but finding different lessons in the history. And then again, there have been lots of talk about a Nuremberg for Russia's crime of aggression and whether Putin could face a Nuremberg tribunal over the Ukraine war. So thank you again. I'm going to see if I can stop sharing my screen now. Okay, here we go. Great. All right.
Okay, thank you. I'm back now. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I would like to encourage everybody to submit questions. And in the meantime, Professor Glaser is going to respond briefly to your wonderful talk. Amelia, please.
I'm so happy to respond. I'm not allowed to share my video, so if somebody wants to enable that, I can also not just be my weird picture that somehow showed up. But whatever, that's fine too. Okay, cool, that works. Awesome. Thank you so much for this really, really important, thought-provoking talk, Professor Hirsch. It was both historically important, but also ending on the note of thinking about today, I think was essential. And this final suggestion that a Nuremberg-style trial should hold not only the the losers of a war accountable, but perhaps also the victors, raises a really important question, right? There's this assumption on the part of the Soviet Union going into the Nuremberg trial that history gets to be written by the victors, that they get to now stage the triumphant performance. And I think what you're suggesting is that maybe war is messier than that. Maybe we don't emerge from wars with this idea that right triumphed. And that, I think that's, kind of an important takeaway from me as we are in a war, as we move through another wartime situation. I wanted to just throw out a couple of questions that you can choose to answer or not answer, and we'll gather other questions as I'm doing that. On the Soviet side, the Nuremberg trials were an indictment of Nazism, but of course, as you show in the book, they also use this as an opportunity to talk about genocide, to talk about their definition of genocide. And in fact, eventually, they would come to point out instances of, that could potentially be seen as genocide on the side of the US. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this term genocide and the differences in interpretation of the term genocide. I know that the Soviet interpretation of genocide was a factor in the way that this was defined at the trials. And it's of course relevant again, because, Putin, when he invaded Ukraine, when Moscow invaded Ukraine, accused Ukraine of genocide. And if you scratched beneath the surface, what was actually being said was that Ukraine was guilty of genocide of Russians by encouraging Russians to identify as Ukrainians, right? That was a form of, we're not even talking about death. We're talking about a sort of cultural adoption. And then of course, we are using, the United States has used the term genocide to discuss what Biden has used the term genocide to discuss what is taking place in Ukraine. So I wonder if you could talk about this term and how that term came to be distilled. I also, if you are willing to share your thoughts on Babyn Yar, that would be especially interesting for me as someone who works on Ukraine. Your book came out shortly before the film that Sergei Loznitsa made about Babyn Yar. And that film, just for those of you who aren't familiar with the film, it's a kind of documentary with a lot of artistry involved, where Loznitsa, this Ukrainian filmmaker, takes footage largely from Soviet trials of Nazis as well as Nazi collaborators, and goes back into the film archives and strings together the story of the Babyn Yar massacre. But there is a large dose of indictment of Ukrainian collaborators in the film, and it came out really at a terrible time for a film to come out, because it came out at this moment when, it really was widely distributed at the moment when troops were being massed on Ukraine's borders, and Ukrainians were incredibly defensive. Loznitsa may have had good intentions. He wanted to, have this wonderful multi-ethnic conversation about culpability, and Ukrainians said, you're going back to a Cold War discussion of the West versus the Soviet Union. And I wonder if you could say anything, if you have anything to say about this return to some of that footage and what needs to be done when we look back at the documents as a way of, I don't know, perhaps reconciling local communities with Jewish communities, local communities sometimes being, being collaborators with Nazis. So that's, Babyn Yar is one example, but certainly not the only one. I'll leave it at that for my questions. And obviously, if we get others, we will, shall I read them as we get other questions in? Or Fran, would you like to take the questions yourself as they appear on the screen?
So where will the questions be coming?
I will read the questions.
Oh, okay, Suzanne will.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yes, I will read the questions. Would you like to respond to Fran, to Amelia first?
Sure. These are big, important questions, and I fear that I won't be able to do them justice. I think the question of genocide. So genocide was not one of the charges that was set out in the Nuremberg Charter. In the indictment, genocide was included as a war crime. And in fact, this is this term that Raphael Lemkin came up with, and that he kind of worked very hard over the course of the trials to try to get the countries of the prosecution, right, to introduce it and to use it, that he felt that it was extremely important to crimes against humanity if it's a focus on individuals, right? Genocide is about the murder, the destruction of a group, and for Lemkin, that was essential. And so for a long time during the trials, it wasn't clear, it wasn't brought into the trials until very late in the game. The British brought it in when they were cross-examining one of the last defendants, von Neurath, and they did it as a way of talking about the effort to wipe out Czech language and culture. And so I think it's really interesting that we tend to think about genocide and the Holocaust and the murder or extermination of the Jews, but the term, how it became used initially in the trial was to talk about murder, but also forced assimilation, and so it becomes complex, and so at Nuremberg, then there are many, and then in the British, again, they come back again in their closing comments, Sir Hartley Shawcross, to talk about the different kinds of genocide that there are, like genocide, the elimination, the extermination of an intelligentsia, genocide, the elimination of a language and culture, along with genocide, also hunger, the use of hunger to wipe out a population. So all of those things were part of this initial idea of genocide. What happens later, right after Nuremberg, in discussions about a genocide convention, that becomes a really difficult conversation. And at that point, the Soviets at that point, there's a motion initially, there are different countries want a broader or narrower definition, a definition that includes cultural genocide, right? That's what Lemkin thought it included, cultural genocide. For him, that was clear. A definition that some groups wanted to include political groups, that it wasn't just the extermination of groups because of religion or culture, but it could be because of their politics too. The Soviets opposed that gets left out. So that's the way that the definition of genocide that we have now is much, much narrower than Lemkin ever anticipated, for all of those kinds of political reasons that we might imagine, right? Of how this is a powerful term, right? How does it get defined? And I'll just add that for the Soviets too, they wanted genocide to be specifically connected with fascism, specifically connected with the Nazis. And so the idea of any state carrying out a genocide, they thought that was not something that they should be talking about. So that's, I think, really key. This question about collaboration that's along with, I think, this question about what do you do with I know, again, after a war, like right now, even, like how do you begin to deal with questions of collaboration? How do you begin to deal with in something where it's so clear cut of one country, invading another country, with war crimes committed on the other side? Is that a fair thing to take up? Is that something that should happen? I think those are really, really, really difficult questions. I think, yeah, and I don't know the answer. I mean, the thing is, with any kind of war crimes trial, there's politics involved, right? And the question with collaboration too, there were efforts to deal with questions of collaboration, in the Soviet Union, in Poland. I'm co-teaching a post-war Europe class now, and this is one of the key themes we've been talking about all semester, is this question of collaboration and complicity, and what does it mean, and how do you resistance, like what does resistance look like when people don't have choices, right? We just read Franziska Exeter's excellent book on Belarusia, right? And she talks about like choiceless choices. So I think, I don't know, these are questions of law and philosophy. It's just so huge. It's just so huge.
Okay, we have some other questions. There's a comment and a couple of questions from David. He writes, excellent and important work, congratulations. And his questions are about future international tribunals. Wasn't the IMT also a victor's trial in connection with the recent, Ukraine crisis? Russia is unlikely to be destroyed and occupied. That's what he's writing. And then, doesn't holding those who surrender forces accountable result in different behaviors, such as leadership abandoning forces rather than surrendering, like in Iraq? So two parts of the questions. I mean, two questions or one.
Yeah, no, it's so as many of you probably know, there are lots of proposals that are on the table right now for different kinds of war crimes trials. So the International Criminal Court, right, it can try certain kinds of cases. And so it could try, war crimes and crimes against humanity. And Ukraine itself has already held some war crimes trials, right? The question is, part of the reason that there's talk for the need for a new Nuremberg is that the International Criminal Court cannot try the crime of aggression unless the countries involved have signed the Kampala amendments and have signed on to that. And so there are limited ways then to try Russia and Russian leaders for aggression. Now, this point about, yes, I mean, the IMT, it was a trial of victor's justice, and whether we talk about victor's justice as like a negative thing or, just a fact, right? And the fact is that the reason that we have an International Criminal Court was because of a discomfort that many of the people involved in Nuremberg, including the French judge, Devab, that they had about, Devab writes about this discomfort that he had, that he understood that this was victor's justice. And the only way to avoid that in the future was for there to be some kind of an International Criminal Court. But the International Criminal Court that we have, along with the United Nations institutions that we have, they're only partly functional because states haven't been willing to cede sovereignty, right? In order for those courts to be able to do what in theory, they're supposed to do or they were designed to do. So that's, one set of questions, one issue. The issue of then, well, if you declare that there's going to be, war crimes trials, will that cause people to act differently in the moment? That was the same debate that they had about Nuremberg, right? That was why the Americans said no until victory was assured, because they thought that there would be reprisals. They thought that that would make the war itself even like more violent, or it would change the nature of the war. And so I think, these are really, really difficult questions. And I think it's good to see that Ukraine is holding war crimes trials. It's good to see that evidence is being collected. There's so much evidence that's being collected. There's just so much evidence of these horrific crimes in a way that I don't think anyone could imagine, right? Like a war happening in real time in the digital age, then the kinds of evidence. And so, but there are questions then too about how will that evidence get processed, how much of that evidence would be accepted in a trial. So I think that even though it's hard to know, like, will there be a tribunal in the future? Like, what would that look like? It is important to think about it now, because for there to be any kind of a tribunal in the future, it means that these difficult conversations have to happen about how do you process and certify evidence? Like, what are the steps that you need to go through? What's the proper way to interview witnesses so that you can use their statements later? And if the world waits until the war is over, until Putin's out of office, until something like that happens, then it'll be too late. They won't have what they need in order to be able to hold those trials. There's been talk about some kind of trial in absentia. I don't know. I mean, and the other truth about this all is that I think it's important to be talking about war crimes trials, but it's the more important conversation is about how to aid Ukraine in the war right now. So I think it's good to have these conversations about collecting evidence, about accountability. These are important conversations to have, but they should not be happening in place of this discussion. I'd like to see more of a discussion in general about concrete steps to take, and concrete steps to take in terms of our international institutions right now too. I mean, just the fact that Russia still has a seat on the Security Council is absurd. So I don't know. I have a lot of feelings about all of this, as I'm sure many of us do.
Right. Just listening to you made me, and reading the questions questions that have been coming in. It really beautifully illustrates how history matters, right? People want to listen to an expert because you have studied this other instance of mass violence, war, and so forth, and people draw on history for guidance. And I'm currently teaching a course at San Diego State. Maybe some of my students are here. It's called Why History Matters. And just your talk above all, but then also the questions people ask that beautifully demonstrates that history does matter and learning about our past. So there's a few more questions. Rainey is asking, can you speak to current, well, actually this deals with the war crimes. Can you speak to the current Russian response to Ukrainian accusations of Russian war crimes? And how do you think, or how you think how to avoid a narrative? Oh, I'm now fully understanding it. It's a question that how can you avoid that the current narrative hijacks any future trials that might be launched by Russia, the US, the UN, or the Ukraine itself? I wonder if that question came across clearly. The current Russian response to Ukrainian accusations of war crimes. Can you say something about that?
Well, I mean, the current Russian response is, right, it's lies and denial and the forging of evidence. It's absurd. I think most people watching this from other countries, right, understand how absurd this is. What I worry about is how Russians are understanding what's happening. And I think that that is a really important question and something that is going to be really critical to think about, because again, I think that one of the key things about Nuremberg was the creation of this historical record, right? The creation of all of this evidence that we have now, right, about what happened during the war. And that is important for denazification. It was important for a reckoning with the past. Right now, if Russians really think that Ukrainians have committed genocide, if Russians really believe this narrative that Putin is putting forward, if they're, and again, you know, different Russians of different generations and living in different places, they seek out or have different access to different kinds of news. And so people who do not have a VPN and do not have, you know, certain internet access, they're getting a restricted picture, right? And even people who do have more of that access and can get more of the story, at a certain point, unless they're willing to put their lives or their family, to put it all on the line, right? What do they do with the information that comes through? I mean, this gets back to this question of like resistance, complicity, like how do we understand those things? So I think that it's going to be critically important, you know, post some kind of like, you know, like imagining a post-war trial where Ukraine's the victor, right? I mean, that will be important for Ukraine, but it will also be incredibly important for Russia, for there to be some kind of a different Russian state in the future, some kind of a real reckoning with what happened.
Okay, you mentioned earlier that Putin, he loves the IMT. He loves to kind of praise the Soviets for their role in it. And that made me think, have you been able, I know first there was, your book came out, then there was the pandemic and then the invasion of Ukraine. Have you been able to share some of your research with a Russian audience or with Russian audiences? I mean, in Russia?
So I was supposed to go over and do all that, but with everything that happened, no. And the book actually, it's under contract to be translated into Russian, and I've been working with a translator, but the publisher is NLO, which is a Russian press, and who knows if it'll come to light. So there have been, you know, I've given a bunch of Zoom talks over the past couple of years, and Russian colleagues have, you know, come to the talk, and you know, and again, some of them, you know, part of the story that I'm telling is a story that Russians really like, right? It's about, you know, Chayinin and the contribution. The part though about Katyn and the secret protocols, I mean, you know, Russian academics know this, and they'll just, you know, it's part of the story. But right now with the memory law, with the foreign agents law, right? With all of the things that the story that I'm telling is illegal, right? So I don't know that, you know, NLO could publish this book. We'll see what happens. And I don't know that a Russian audience would be receptive. It's really hard to know. Yeah.
Right. We have one last question, and this is by Joya. She raises a very interesting issue. What do you think are the implications of Russia not being brought to justice for crimes against humanity in Syria, Chechnya, Georgia, and elsewhere?
I mean, significant, right? But I think, I mean, not just Russia. I mean, I think, again, we have a history with these international institutions where states are not willing to cede sovereignty in order to have military and leaders, right, brought before those courts. So I think very significant. And I think, again, it feels like when I talk about the progressive development of international law with lawyers, they tell me I'm naive and that whole idea is kind of crazy and like no one really believes in that anymore. But I think that we're going to have to get to a point where we rethink our international institutions, where we're going to have to decide, does this matter? Do we want to have a functioning international criminal court? And if we do, like, all states are we're going to have to get rid of the veto, right, at the Security Council. And all states are going to have to be willing to go before an international tribunal. But the politics of that, and, you know, what states see as the dangers of that, and in some cases, you know, probably rightly so, I don't know how you bring it all together. I don't know how you rectify it. Yeah, if anyone has any suggestions, let's talk about it, right? I mean, it's a conversation. I think it's an important conversation.
Yes, and it's obviously, as you touched on earlier, I mean, it does affect other countries, not just the former Soviet Union / Russia. I mean, I'm thinking some of the work I've been doing a little bit on the side dealt with informal tribunals, specifically in case with India. But I was, in the course of my research, I came across, and I'm sure you're familiar, the World Tribunal on Iraq. It was obviously not official, but it indicted President Bush for invading Iraq. And I think symbolically it was significant, although it led to nothing, obviously. But so, yeah, personally, I welcome your call for everybody being held accountable, but that might, as your colleagues say, that may be naive. I don't know.
Right. I'm a historian, though, so, you know, I don't know how I can like be naive or, I don't know, try to, yeah, but it's difficult, right? You want to believe in your international institutions. You want to believe in international law. I don't know how, I mean, I don't know, should we just be hopeful that maybe this all, I don't know, it's just a terrible time right now. It's just a really terrible time. So
yeah, I was going to say on that note, well, I think those of us who follow the news, we can't argue with that. It is terrible and scary. And of course, above all for the Ukrainians. Well, I would like to thank you. I'm sure we all thank you for a truly illuminating lecture, Fran. Thank you also to everybody who joined us today. Before you leave, I would like to draw your attention to our next event. This will be the first event on campus in the Geisel Library since the start of the pandemic. We last met in February 2020 in the Geisel Library. So on November 2nd, we will host Almar Boom, a distinguished professor of anthropology at UCLA. Professor Boom is going to talk about the neglected part of the Holocaust, the Vichy slave labor camps that were run in the Saharan desert. So please look for an announcement and the registration link in your inbox over the coming weeks. And now I wish you all good night, and I see you next time. Thank you again, Fran, very much for sharing your insight with us, your many insights. And thank you, Amelia. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your excellent questions too.